All right, we talked about testing Angular services, and now let's look at the part of the guide that talks about component testing. So the first portion of it here is mentioning testing things without asserting against manipulated DOM of the component. Because imagine that, actually, step back. Angular components consist of two parts always, right? At least there are two parts. First is the controller itself, where there sits of the JavaScript. Like if we look at the example here, this is the JavaScript part of the component, but it also has template part that contains HTML. Now, when you are testing a component, what you can do is doing some simplified testing. You can test against individual methods in the component instead of testing that whatever template is using for the methods that are implemented in JavaScript, whatever happens to the elements in HTML, instead of asserting against that, you assert against directly calling the methods. To demonstrate this scenario, I'm going to create a component locally with my app and just demonstrate that. And I can tell ahead that I'm not a fan of this just direct component class testing, because components are never about just pure JavaScript. They are always about some manipulation in the template where you have some HTML that's being dynamically manipulated through your code that you write in component. So when you're testing just the JavaScript in the component, that doesn't really cover the whole functionality of the component, because whatever these methods do, it's usually a way to implement some kind of behavior in the template, but it's not the behavior itself. Like there's some behavior when you click on the button and, for example, notification service should pop a notification. These are just mechanisms to do that. It's not the actual behavior. So let me dive into the code here and generate a new component. So ng generate component, and then we'll name, I'll just call it component 1. And then I'm going to jump start the tests here as well. And then I'm going to open this in VS Code. And then open the newly generated component, component 1. So we're talking about class testing, right? So imagine that we have a template and we have a class. And what kind of scenario should we simulate here? Let me think about it. So let's say we have a template here, right? And it provides a field. Let's say it provides an input, or maybe, actually no, let's do something else. Let's say it provides a button. So let's do just button like that. And then what the button will do, it will increment value. Okay, that's the title, that's the name of the button. And then we are going to bind to the click event, and whenever user clicks on it, we are going to call increment function, just like that. And then at the same time, we'll have a div that will display the count, just like this. Okay, so now let's go to the controller and here declare the count property, and then declare the increment method. Okay, so initially let's give count 0, and then when increment occurs, we'll do count plus equals, so let's do it just explicitly, count plus 1. And this should be actually this and this. Okay, so we have super basic counting functionality here, right? These things should disappear. And then to test that, let me serve the app here so I can load it in the browser. So it'll be loaded in localhost 4200 once this finishes running. So right now I'm building some super simple functionality that I can demonstrate how we can test that using the first suggestion that they have in the guide, which is about just pure class testing versus DOM testing right here. Alright, so we have our application running, so I can open it in the browser. Oh, there you go, it's loaded. And oh, actually, I created the component, right? But I never put it anywhere in the main application template. So I'm going to just delete all this stuff and say component 1, app component 1, just like this. Let's see if this works. Huh, look at that, it worked right away. That's awesome. Okay, that's our super simple functionality here, incrementing value. If I reload the page, that disappears. All right. Now, how would you go about testing here? What the first method suggests, and how to test that is by, let's go into the tests for component 1 right here. Then this is the default test that was generated with ng generate command. Here I will say that I'm testing the functionality that it should increment when clicking on the button. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is to click on that button to increment the value and then assert. So let me comment this and describe what I'm doing here in the test. So what I need to do first, I need to grab the button from the DOM, right? And then I need to click on the button. And then I need to assert that the value got incremented. So I just need to fulfill these 3 steps. So grabbing the button. How you grab buttons, you use fixture, right? Use fixture, and then you refer to the native element, and then you say query selector. And then here you specify the CSS selector against the element. If we look at the template, this doesn't have any selectors. Actually, button. We have only one button here, so I'll just say button like this. And it should find the button. And then I'll try to click on it. I'll just see what happens. For now, I'm just going to run that test. And there's some failures going on here. Where's that coming from? Error context. Go increment is not a function. CO increment is not a function. Is that my new test failing? This one? What is it doesn't like? You know what? Let me exclude this test from the current suite of tests that runs and see if things start passing. They are not passing. So where is it failing now? Oh, it's tests for app HTML that are failing. So I'm going to go, I'm sorry, app component tests right here. So I'm just going to exclude those. Okay, and then remove the exclusion of component 1 tests and let that whole thing run. I just want to make sure that I have all tests passing before I start writing this test. Okay, so here I grabbed the button. I think I clicked on it. I think that should just work. And look at this. I actually did these two steps at the same time. I grabbed the button and I clicked on it in one swift motion. Excuse me, and now I need to assert that the increment happened. Now that's where the key difference is going to be in terms of the first method of testing, where they say here for doing class testing, what they say what you can test is our expectation will be, I'm sorry, it's not like that, it's expect, and then reference to the component will be like this, and then it has a count property, right? That's where the increment happens. And what we're going to assert is that the count should be, after clicking once on it, right, it should be 1. It was 0 before the clicks, and now it should be 1. Remove this, and let's see what happens when the tests run. Well, now it says undefined. We expected that undefined to be 1. I think that's because we need to run detect changes after clicking on things. So let's see if that makes any difference. It still says undefined to be 1. So somehow count property is not getting recognized in the component here. So am I missing something? Not sure what that would be. Let's look at their example one more time. So what they are doing in the test is here they are not even using any testbed stuff. So that's interesting. Actually, if I look at the controller of this component, when this component initializes, the count should by default initialize to 1. Actually, I think that's because this property is not public. That was the problem. Now, yeah, when you're referring to the component properties, when you say count, this must be a public property. If it's private, you can't refer it like this. That's why it's just undefined. Now let's see if that assumption was correct. And there you go. Awesome. Now test is passing after clicking on the button to increment that. And there you go. That demonstrates there's the first method of passing, of testing the behavior. Now, as I mentioned before, I don't think it's useful. I think what we should assert against is that instead of looking at this internal property of the component, checking that it was incremented, the problem is looking at this internal property is that this is just an internal mechanism of the component to keep track of the count. It's not what the component is doing from the user perspective. From user perspective, yeah, what component doing is from user perspective is displaying the counter. So what we should asserting against is the displayed counter, not what the counter internal property of the component is. So I'm going to add an alternative expect statement here where I will instead query the element. So I'll say fixture native element, and then I'll use query selector and I'll query how can we find this element. So it's just div. We have only one div with the counter. In that div, just like this, should contain, so now we'll look into the text contain, no, that doesn't sound right. Text content, that's right. That's native HTML element property that contains the text of what's inside of that div. So it'll be the counter here. And we expect it to be 1 here. Okay, so let's delete or comment out this assertion and leave the assertion that actually queries the element that's being displayed in the template, which is the final expected behavior of the component, that it should be displaying counter in this div, and that's what the user is seeing, in fact. Okay, so let's try to rerun that test and let's see if it's still passing, and it doesn't. Actually, I'm asserting here that 1 is a digit, but in fact, when you're querying against text content of an HTML element, you should be asserting against strings. So now if I update that, and now it's passing. There you go. Now I think it's a lot more useful test, because I can rename this count property and I will not break this existing test. To demonstrate that, I go here and I'll just rename count to, let's say, CNT, like this, and then I do the same here. Okay, so you see how everything is still supposed to work internally, except that I need to update the template. Here I should say CNT, right? Because that's the new property name. And then everything should work. If I reload this thing in the browser, let's see, reloads, everything works, right? Everything's cool. And if I look at the test as well, this is also passing. And note that if I had the test written, if I hadn't written test in the previous style, let's just uncomment it and let's see. If I had it like this and I would rerun the tests, it would fail because I renamed the property. And that's where the fragility of this method comes, because this is just an internal property of keeping the count, and when you're factoring things, you can rename things whatever you want. You want to be able to reshuffle the internals of the components whatever you want without breaking the expected behavior in terms of the user experience, and using assertions that assert against DOM manipulation is a lot more, what's the other word for when it's not fragile? It's a lot more robust. All right, so I hope that that demonstrates why this is superior. And then in the next videos, we are going to explore all these scenarios with component testing in the Angular unit testing guide.